Good afternoon and warmly welcome to this webinar on the pros and cons of superstar firms. My name is Daniel Lind and I work as a research director at a trade union related think tank called Arenagruppen. And in that position, I'm responsible for a 3-year project on productivity and labor markets, financed by the 5 unions within Swedish industry. Our guest today is John van Reenen. He's a professor of economics at London School of Economics, and he has written more than 100 papers on several different topics, but mainly focused on, I should say, maybe productivity, innovation, and firm performance. Recently, he has also contributed to the literature on these superstar firms. John, we are very honored having you with us today.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Yeah, thanks. And the setup for today is very simple. John starts his presentation and goes through the presentation for around 30 minutes. Then we open up for a discussion among the two of us, and then we open up for questions from the viewers. So please state your short and sharp questions in the chat, and we will bring them up later on. All in all, we have around 55 minutes at our disposal. So having said this, John, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here and to share a few thoughts with you on superstar firms and inequality. So let me just get my slides going. So I'll talk a little bit about where I'm coming from, and then also give you some facts on what I call increasing differences across firms in different countries in the world. I should say I'm no expert on Sweden, so I'm afraid, although there will be some graphs with Swedish data, and most of it won't be on Sweden, but I'll give you an overview from lots of different countries. Then something on markups, on profitability of firms, something on labour, very relevant for the trade union movements, and then try to give a bit of an assessment and some policy implications from what has been going on with the growth of these so-called superstar firms. So, I start off with this lead story, this cover story from Forbes magazine from about a year and a half ago, which states, as you can see, that Apple became the first company in the world which had a market value of more than $3 trillion, which happened to be greater than the GDP of the UK. So that is a pretty big firm. Although we should be careful, it's just the stock of market value and the flow of GDP, but still, 3 trillion is a lot of money. And the Prime Minister of the time, who you might have forgotten, was a bit shocked by this fact. There's actually 2 Prime Ministers ago. We were our 3rd Prime Minister since then, a year and a half ago. And I looked at some of the numbers of these kind of big firms, big high-valued firms. So here are the numbers as of about a week ago. Apple worth fallen a little bit in value and recovered, but just under $3 trillion. Microsoft, 2.8 trillion. Alphabet, which owns Google, 1.7 trillion. Amazon, 1.5 trillion. Facebook, about $0.9 trillion. So these are sometimes called the GAFAM firms: Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, Microsoft. I like GAFA because in British Cockney London rhyming slang, a gaffer means a boss. So these are the boss firms of the modern economy. Very large firms, larger than many developed countries' GDP, as we just saw. Now, the story I just wanted to give you the next 25 minutes or so is just to kind of map the growth of these superstar firms. And I'm going to show you that the growth goes beyond the high-tech sector. When you look at those firms, you might think, well, these are all the kind of in the high-tech sector, and then there has been this growth of superstars in the high-tech sector, but it actually goes much beyond that. I'm going to show you that it goes into sectors like retail, wholesale, utilities, finance, and so on. And there are some benefits to the growth of these large firms, as you might imagine with innovation, but it also raises concerns that employer market power has increased. I'm going to focus on product market power, that will also touch on labor market power, but I'll show you how these markets interrelate with each other. So as these firms get more power in the product market, they also has implications for what might happen to wages. So the costs potentially of the increased dominance of these firms could be lower real wages because of higher prices, if these firms have product market power to increase prices and markups. If they're less productive because they're becoming less efficient, or they're slowing down productivity growth, then that's also going to feed through to lower real wages. And we have seen falling productivity growth across the world over the last 15 years or so. I can also show that one implication of growing market power or growing size of these superstar firms is that we get bigger differences between labor and capital. So in other words, the share of GDP or national income going to labor has fallen in many countries, and particularly the United States. So that clearly is something which many people would be concerned about. And also there can also be greater inequality between workers. So as I'll show you, as superstar firms who pay higher wages pull away from the rest, this also tends to increase wage inequality between those who are lucky enough perhaps to work in these type of firms and most people who work in firms which are non-superstars and pay lower wages. So there's also, and this is the third bullet point, maybe broader concerns around the strength of these firms, how they affect democracy through lobbying to shift the rules of the game, through affecting privacy. I'm going to have less to say on those. Maybe we can talk about that in the Q&A. I'm going to focus a bit more on the kind of economic things, but clearly those are also important issues, which are something that we should be concerned about. Okay, so let me just map what I mean by increasing differences across firms. So here is the simplest fact. So this takes US data, and I'm going to take, there's no one definition of a superstar firm, but here's one way to think about it, a kind of labor economist way to think about it. Let's look at all the people working for firms in the US economy, and let's look at the share of workers in big firms. And I'm going to define big by firms who employ more than 5,000 workers. So you can just pull this off the US Census Bureau statistics. So, there's about 2,600 firms which have more than 5,000 workers. In the mid-1980s, these superstar firms accounted for 28% of all jobs. And for the latest figures in 2021, about 36% of all jobs are in these superstar firms. That's something like a 7 or 8 percentage point increase over this period. So that's a very dramatic increase of where people are working, increasingly working. Well over a third of the population of people working for firms are working in these very large firms, which are like 0.05% of all firms in the economy. So that's one way of measuring the growth of kind of superstar firms. One problem with doing this is that you're measuring a firm by how many people it employs. And if you think about some of the firms I mentioned at the beginning, the Facebooks, the Microsofts, the Googles, their kind of footprint, their economic footprint is much bigger than simply the number of workers that they employ. So I used to work in Stanford. If you go around Mountain View, the headquarters of Google, it's the surprisingly few people who are there. Mm. Many of these firms have what my co-author Eric Brynjolfsson calls scale without mass. So the footprint is very big in terms of their sales or market value. The mass and number of employees is relatively small. So a better way, in some ways, to think about the footprint or strength of these firms, look at their turnover, their revenue, their sales. And also you might want to express that, this is just looking at the whole economy, you might want to express that relative to the industry that they're in to give you a sense of are they becoming more important for those industries. So in work with David Autor and Larry Katz and other people, we've been documenting this. This is from a new paper we've just got out, which updates some of our earlier work in the Quarterly Journal of Economics. So what we do is we take the population, so basically all workers in the US, and then we look in detailed industries, so 4-digit industry like cement or or pharmaceuticals. And then we say, well, what fraction of sales in that industry is going to the largest firms? So let me just take the manufacturing industry, for example, up here. Underlying this is about 400 different industries. And each industry, we've looked at the fraction of sales going to the biggest 4 firms, or the fraction of sales going to the biggest 20 firms. This is in sales. And you can see that the concentration in sales is much bigger than the concentration in employment. But wherever you look in these broad sectors, this, like I said, these are averages over hundreds and hundreds of different industries, you can see a very similar pattern over the last 40 years. The degree of concentration has increased, whether you look at manufacturing, retail. So the high-tech firms are mainly in services, and you can see they've gone up, but they've got Walmart, you can see would be an example of a Costco, big retail firm, utilities, finance, wholesale. Everywhere you look, there's been this substantial increase of concentration towards larger firms. So it's not just the kind of high-tech industries where this has happened. You might say, well, this is the US, Europe is different. So here's Sweden. I got Sweden and many other European countries here. This is the average concentration. Again, across many different firms, averaged in manufacturing, averaged in market services. And you can see we don't have data for as long as we have in the US, but over the period that we have from about 2000, you also see this increase of concentration occurring. So it's not just a US phenomenon; it's also something which has happened in other countries as well, like in the European Union. So those are kind of measures of concentration, either sales or employment. And the center, as Daniel said, is about productivity. So we also look at productivity. So let me just hone in on the UK as one example, since I'm in the UK. So what we did in the UK was we took the data over the last 20 years, basically all firms in the economy, and we looked at what had happened to productivity. This is a simple measure of productivity, which is value added per worker. And we split that down into the median firm. So this is the firm in the middle of the economy. So 50% of all workers work for firms below the median, 50% of workers above the median. And you can see this rather sad picture in the UK, where there's been hardly any productivity growth after the global financial crisis. This is well known. You see this in the macro statistics. Productivity growth collapsed in the UK and has been very lackluster. But if you look at the top of the distribution, the top 10% of firms, you see a rather different picture. For them, productivity has grown pretty substantially throughout this period. So the difference between the kind of superstars at the top and the median firms got wider and wider. So these top firms are pulling away from the others in terms of their productivity performance. So not just their size, but also their productivity. If you look at this is showing what's happening in the bottom 10%. So you can see this increased difference between the firms at the top, the firms in the middle, and the firms at the bottom. These bottom firms have even seen some falls of their productivity. Again, that's the UK. This picture looks at the rest of the European, a mix of 16 OECD countries. And this is just showing you the change of productivity, both labor productivity or this other measure of total factor productivity, manufacturing and services. And this is just showing you that there's increased productivity inequality across all these countries in the OECD. So there is within each country, there's been this increase of difference in productivity across firms. What about wages? So back to the UK. This is the average wage growth in different firms for the top firms, the medium firms, the bottom firms, and you can see this looks a lot like what's happened to productivity. So the average wages between firms have also become more dispersed. Some people sometimes describe this as the kind of McDonald's McKinsey economy. So McKinsey, you get lots of very high wage people together, and at McDonald's you get lots of very low wage people together. So you've got this increase of dispersion between workers working for different types of firms. So, although we know this is true, if you looked at all the individuals in the economy, this is looking at the average wages in the economy by firm. So it's showing you that firms are becoming increasingly different in their productivity and also in the wages that they pay. And, if you think that part of the way that people get paid, partly it depends on their own productivity, but partly it depends on how well their firm is performing. If you're lucky to work for a highly performing, high productivity firm, typically workers gain in some of those benefits. It's called rent sharing. And if you think that productivity is becoming increasingly different, then that's also going to mean that wages also tend to become increasingly different as well. It's a force for increasing wage inequality, which is what we've seen. Okay, so then the final thing on increasing differences I'm going to do this. This is again wages, but looking at the US, where you can get very rich data on individual wages. So what this is showing, it's a slightly complicated graph, but it's relatively simple to understand. What this is saying is that over like the 35-year period or 34-year period since 1981, what's happened to wages at different points of the distribution. So these are the kind of lowest wage workers, and these are the highest wage workers. And what these lines are showing you is how those wages have changed. So if you look at the blue line here, this is kind of what we know has happened in the US. If you were a low wage worker, you've hardly had any increase of your real wages over the last kind of 30 years or so. The wage growth has been pretty close to zero. If you're a very high wage worker, you're lucky enough to be in the top few percentiles of the distribution, your wages have increased a lot. So this is the big increase of wage inequality in the US. So we kind of know that. It's been something that labor economists have talked about for a long time. But the new evidence which is coming out is to do with this red dots here. And what these red dots here are showing you the average of earnings of the firm. And what these green dots are showing you here is what's happened to inequality within firms. And what the green dots are saying is that within firms, there hasn't been much increase of inequality. Maybe right at the top, maybe CEOs are getting, really big pay increases. Oops, sorry. But mostly the increase of inequality is not due to inequality increasing within a firm. It's because you get increasing differences between firms. If you're lucky enough to be at a high wage firm, you're getting a high wage. If you're unlucky enough to be at a low wage firm, you're getting a low wage. So these increasing differences between firms in terms of the productivity, in terms of the size, is also being reflected in increasing differences of wages between workers. So part of that might be rent sharing. Part of this might be segregation, high-skilled workers working with high-skilled workers, increasingly low-skilled workers working with low-skilled workers. So that's also a phenomenon going on. But altogether, this is saying the firm you work for looks like it's incredibly important and much more important than it was, say, 30, 40 years ago. Okay, so that's a set of facts on increasing differences. The next thing I want to talk about in terms of what's been happening to the economy is what's been happening to markups. So, markups are the differences between the prices firms charge and the kind of cost they have to pay, the marginal cost they have to pay. Typically, we like to think of this as the kind of gross margin or the kind of markup. So, what's been happening to that over time? So again, this is US data. This shows you, this is what the work with David Alter that we did a few years ago. This is showing you that the markup that firms are able to charge appears to be increasing. It was about 30% above costs in the early 80s, and today it's more like kind of 50 or 60%. So a big increase. Remember, this is not the same as profits, because with profits you also deduct off fixed costs. This is relative to variable or marginal costs. So that's the average, and it looks like this is a typical measure of employer market power, and it looks like it's increased over time in the US. If you look again at the average firm, the median firm, then that hasn't gone up by very much at all. And again, this is reflecting these increasing differences. There's some superstar firms who are at the top, who are increasingly getting high markups, whereas the average firm, not much has actually changed. That's the US. We could also look around the world. This is kind of Europe. That was North America, but dominated with the US, South America, Asia, Oceania, and Africa. These are listed firms using work by Jan de Lokier. And you can see again, although markups are higher in the US than they are in Europe, the trends are actually pretty similar across this 30 or 40 year period. So this increase of markups that firms are having, and again, this is driven by the larger superstar firms, is kind of driving up average markups, not just in the US, but kind of around the world. Okay, so what does all this mean? Well, industrial concentration has risen, especially for sales. Markups over marginal costs have risen, driven by chains at the top, and this seems to be happening across the OECD, not just in the US. So, at this point, it's a good question to ask: is this a good thing or a bad thing? So everybody says, oh, you shouldn't automatically assume this is all bad. I mean, there are some benefits from having these superstar firms. So if these firms are more productive, allocating more output towards these firms should be a force to help increase aggregate productivity. If you give more output to the more productive firms, it should actually increase aggregate productivity. That's the reallocation, the Schumpeterian effect, which we think is a kind of a positive effect. Secondly, when we think about these superstars, they're not classical monopolists, big, fat, lazy monopolists, not, just charging higher prices and doing no technical change or innovation. The companies that we're thinking of here, the kind of Googles, the Microsoft, the Apples, are doing a lot of innovation. So they're not the kind of classical monopolists that we may think of. So I think that's the second thing. I'll go through why. There's various reasons why these firms have got to be superstar firms, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But the first thing to say is that they're not the obviously classical type of monopolists. Now, of course, those are the benefits, but there's also lots of potential costs. So to the extent these firms can exercise market power, this is likely to lead to negative outcomes. Prices are higher than they would otherwise be. If prices are higher, real wages are going to be lower. There's innovation, but maybe innovation could be even higher if there was stronger competition. So, although in principle they could have helped increase productivity growth, in practice, we know productivity growth has been slowing down since at least the global financial crisis. And that also leads to the concern, well, maybe the superstars have attained their size partly due to the exercise of this power. I mean, are they becoming better at creating barriers to entry, keeping their smaller rivals down? So, for example, by having lots of patents, maybe they can prevent the diffusion of knowledge and information to some of these smaller firms. Maybe their strength is allowing them to lobby, to change the rules of the game, to prevent regulators, antitrust, competition authorities, reducing their monopoly power, killer acquisitions. Maybe they're buying up the promising startups and then absorbing their innovations or even killing their innovations off. That's a concern which has been raised for many of them. So, and then there's a set of implications as well over what we think is going to happen, as I mentioned, to labour markets and inequality. So I'm going to focus on one aspect of inequality now, which is what's happened to the share of labour. So if you look at the US, again, this is the share of GDP which is going to labour. And this is since the Second World War. And you can see that there has been this kind of fall of the share going to labour. So if you think about the GDP, the economic pie, some of it can go to capital, some will go to labour. The share which is going to labour has fallen, a fair bit from 64% in the 1982 down to something like 56% today. So quite a significant fall of the fraction of GDP going to workers. And again, here's the four big countries in the world, US, Japan, Germany, and China. And you can see that the trend is not just down in the US, but it's also down in several other of the big major countries as well. Not everywhere, though. I understand, Daniel, I think said, this, in Sweden, this hasn't happened. In the UK, there hasn't been a massive downward fall of the labour share. There was some fall of the 80s and it went up in the late 90s and then it's gone down a bit. So it's kind of gone, it hasn't really fallen very dramatically over the sample period. There's a kind of cyclical, there's a component in the 80s, an increase. And so, more or less stability, nothing like the US. So, you might say, well, what's kind of going on here? What could be, what could be the factors, since I showed you that the superstar firms have kind of been growing everywhere? Why is it some countries like the UK have kind of mitigated these kind of forces? And I think one argument for why that is that there have been some counterbalances to firms' power, particularly maybe the monopoly power. So the UK introduced the first national minimum wage it's ever had in 1999. And the strength of that has become increasingly strong over time. And there's some evidence that, I mentioned this paper with Steve Machin and Mirko Draker that we did a few years ago, that if you look at the impact of the minimum wage, that it tended to increase wages at the bottom of the distribution. without significantly reducing jobs. So that's going to increase the wageable share. But it did squeeze profits, especially when firms had some product market power, according to our estimates. So if you look at, this is the so-called bite of the minimum wage. So it's the level of the minimum wage relative to median workers. So this is when the minimum wage is introduced. It was introduced, at a relatively low level, but then has become increasingly strong over time. So the strength of the minimum wage has increased. So you could think about this as being maybe a counterbalancing influence to the downward pressure on the labour share, and also a counterbalancing influence to the increased pressures towards higher inequality amongst workers. So, in the final 5 minutes, let me just give you a bit of an assessment of how I think things have been going and some policy implications. So, what are, you might say, well, what are the causes or the potential causes of the rise of superstar firms? So one view is it's to do with institutions. So it's because the antitrust, the competition authorities have been asleep at the wheel, allowing too many mega mergers to take place and lowering competition or enforcing competition policy. A second group of explanations focuses on technology. So there's two flavors of this, or at least two flavors of this. One is that going back to some of the high-tech firms, they enjoy many network effects. So you get this kind of winner-takes-all phenomenon. So think about Google. Google has this amazing kind of search engine that we use every day. The more we use it, the more information Google gets on the queries we have and whether it's useful to us. And the more information it gets, the better its algorithm comes to help us find new things. So the more we use it, the better the search engine gets, the better search engine gets, the more we use it. So that kind of chicken and egg, that network effect, means that typically many of these high-tech markets tip towards these dominant firms, and that's the kind of network effect. You see this, of course, in social networks. You see this, everybody wants to be in the biggest social network, and so on and so forth. And that, of course, means that as the market tips towards the dominant player, they can charge more for advertising on their platforms, and this monetizes what they do. So that's one story. That's an innovation story. Of course, because this has happened not just in the high-tech sector, as I've shown you, it's happened in things like retail, that it can't just be that. And I think what's happening in many of the other sectors is more to do with the diffusion of new technology. So if you think that I call the first one the Google story, this is the Walmart story. So why has Walmart become so successful? Partly it's because it's made these huge billions of dollars investments in software, which enables it to run a very complicated logistics system, moving things, distributing things around the whole of the US from its distribution centers and wholesale centers, having just-in-time management with these very sophisticated enterprise resource planning software systems, so it can know when it's stocking out things and replacing them. And those huge investments in software can't be replicated by small chains or mom and pop stores. So the types of advances you get from many of the new technologies has given big advantages to big firms, because they're the ones who can actually use these high fixed costs type of digital systems. So those are technological factors are another two reasons. There could also be reasons of globalization, falling trade costs, and changing global value chains as a kind of third set of explanations as well. I mean, obviously different things are important in different sectors and different countries, but just some thoughts on this. The fact that we see in terms of the rise of superstar firms, concentration, increasing differences, those similar qualitative patterns across countries suggest there's more likely some underlying causes. So I think stories that it's all to do with weaker antitrust enforcement in the US, I don't think are very compelling stories. I mean, if you look at the European competition authorities, DG Comp, no one is saying that they're kind of too weak. I mean, there's lots of companies complaining they're too tough. So they've actually taken quite an aggressive position on antitrust enforcement. Yet nevertheless, we've also seen some similar patterns happening in Europe. So I think that stories which are all to do with specific institutions are less plausible than the stories which I've mentioned, which are to do with technological changes like platform competition, like the Google story, or adoption of digital intangible capital like the kind of Walmart type of story. So then there's different pieces of evidence suggesting this. That, of course, that's not to say there are not examples in certain industries where weaker competition is the story. But as a general explanation of what's going on, I think some of these technology stories are more plausible. So what does this mean for policy? I think given that some of the growth of these firms is due to technological changes, I think just saying, what we should do is just break these firms up or, stop them ever growing, I think is not the right answer. I think the right answer is to, first of all, realize that even if the growth is due to technological reasons, it's created this much more winner take all. So I do think we need to think about reforming different policies to take it into account. So even if a company has achieved a strong position by competing on the merits, once it's got to that position, it may start doing things which are harmful to consumers and workers. So I do think we need to modernize our antitrust policies, for example, our competition policies, to reduce the risks of harm. So, for example, I'm a big supporter of the Digital Markets Act that the European Union has introduced, which is an attempt to have more ex-ante regulation of these very large firms to try and force them to be more interoperable with other firms, to improve data portability and greater access, to make the structural conditions for competition being stronger. I think when we think about mergers, we need to take into account the impact on innovation, on future competition. Too much of merger assessment is backward looking rather than forward looking. And we also need to think about whether it's going to help create monopsony. So that's an important factor when we judge a merger. I think we need to shift the standards of proof more towards the firms instead of putting all the burden of proof on government regulators. Very hard to prove a merger is going to be anti-competitive in these kind of high-tech industries. But I think we have to take a more rule of reason type of approach. And then my second group of policy recommendations, and it goes back to this UK example I just gave, is that we have to think about mechanisms to counterbalance some of these firms' powers through labour market policy. So I gave the UK example, the minimum wage, but we could also think of many other ways to strengthen the hand of workers. So, for example, there's a surprisingly large number of firms which have non-compete clauses, so that if you leave one firm, you can't go to work for another firm in the same industry, and that even happens in many low-skilled industries. So I think there's quite a strong argument for stopping or banning those non-competes, to enforcing banning no poaching agreements. All these things can help strengthen job mobility. Of course, we have to think about increasing human capital and improve training. And we also have to think about institutions such as collective bargaining, of labour standards, and of minimum wages as ways of trying to counterbalance some of the power of the superstar firms in the labour market. So to conclude, I think I've shown you there's these growing differences between superstar firms and the rest of the economy through many measures: increased concentration, increasing wage differences, and also growing markups. It helps explain some of the fall of the labour share that we've seen in the US and many other countries, but we have to consider this in a kind of imperfect competition type of view. In terms of explanations for why this has happened, I think the dominant factor is technological changes. So both innovation in the digital producing sectors, but also in industries which use digital technology a lot. And I think that actually, even though I think it's technology the underlying force driving this, I think that there are many areas, and I've given you two examples of product market competition policy and labour market institutions, where we need to think about reforming in order to deal with this new winner-take-all kind of world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this, John, for very, very clear and informative presentation. I have, of course, many questions, but a short question I will start with is, your colleague David Autor has tried to disentangle between the effects of technology and the effects of globalization. When you think about the technology as the important driver, do you see like globalization is part of this too? Because globalization was made possible by technological change. So how do you relate those two?
Yeah, I mean, they're closely intertwined. I mean, most of my career, we've been looking, at these three factors: globalization, technology, and institutions.
Yeah.
I know, and as you said, globalization has been made possible by reducing transportation costs and improving communications and computers. And also, globalization itself spurs the use of new technology. So, I have some work looking at the way that China has influenced the adoption of technology in Europe. So I think they're kind of quite intertwined. But in my view, say if we were thinking about what's happening to the demand for labor or demand for labor by different skill groups, my sense is still that it's the technological forces which are the kind of dominant forces more than globalization. I think it's easy in a way, and David's own work shows that, to look at the local effects of trade. You can see it's had negative effects on places like in Oklahoma producing furniture, and now they get wiped out. It's much harder to see that kind of also has positive effects on other places who can now buy cheaper furniture or cheaper materials from China, and that's actually helped other places. So my sense is that although there are clearly costs of globalization, I think people have probably put too much emphasis on it relative to the kind of technological factors. But both are important for sure.
Okay. Thank you. Then we continue on the path of technology and the small question of AI. What do you think about the role of AI when it comes to the future distribution of the size of the firms? Do this AI contribute to the growing trend of bigger superstar firms?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, it's like, forecasting the future is always a risky thing to do. I mean, there's two views on this. So one view is that it's going to be very good for small firms. So it's going to enable lots of new entrants as people get information more easily. My feeling is it's actually going to reinforce the dominance of these very large firms, because one of the big benefits, how do you create good AI algorithms? It's basically about data. So the real advances we made in AI have been less on the improvement of the algorithms and more just on the fact we have much bigger data sets to train these algorithms over, and we can use stronger computers to do that. And these very large companies like Microsoft and Google, who have the scale and resources to actually spend lots of money getting the data and keeping that data for themselves to use it, helps them actually create these kind of superior algorithms. So of course, smaller firms like, we've seen OpenAI can get set up, but they often end up getting bought up. And the very skilled individuals who are actually involved, the number of people who are AI specialists is pretty small. They can also be kind of hoovered up by the highest paying firms offering the best deals. So my sense is that in terms of the superstar firm phenomena, AI is more likely to reinforce it than to undermine it. Then there's the question of productivity. Do you want me to talk about AI and productivity? Because and labor markets is also on top of people's minds. So two things. So one, on the labor market side, some people say, like I think Elon Musk said this: there's going to be no more jobs in the future because AI is going to take over everything. And our prime minister here was a bit shocked. I'm pretty skeptical about that. I think we've seen no signs of it yet. I mean, maybe I might be wrong, but every generation with every new technology, people are always terrified that it's going to destroy all jobs, and yet it never does. And I think the main thing to be, because we find new things to do. We always find new things. I mean, maybe when artificial general intelligence comes along, perhaps. But I think humans have been very versatile about finding new things to do. I think the real issue is the quality rather than the quantity of jobs. So to what extent is AI going to reduce wages or reduce the kind of quality, the level of wages at different points of distribution? And there, I think, for relatively more skilled people like yourself and probably most of the audience, there is something to be worried about, because unlike, say, robots which affected production workers or or computers, which mainly affected, clerical people in the middle distribution. AI is affecting much more skilled people, the kind of computer programmers, some of the routine teachers and so on. So I think it's actually going to have more of an effect further up the wage distribution. On productivity, again, this should also be a reason why we shouldn't be too worried about all the jobs are going to go. The history of technology is it takes quite a while before any new technology starts having an effect on productivity. And we saw that whether we looked at electricity or we looked at computers, and I think the same is going to be true of AI. And the reason is that there's one thing about spending loads of money on a technology, but actually managing to use that to improve productivity requires a lot of experimentation, a lot of learning, a lot of changes of the way that we work. So with electricity, it wasn't until people started working in 24-hour factories and using production lines that really increased productivity. And it was a new form of work organization, a new form of organizing our societies. I think those changes are much harder to make than just spending a bunch of money on, on Chat GPT or whatever its latest version is. So I think it's going to take some more time before we really see that hitting the productivity numbers.
Kind of a Solov AI paradox, then we have to wait a while.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. I want to continue with this, the effect on labor, because your colleagues have written a book, Power and Progress, Asimoglu and Simon Johnson, and they write that it's important for society to kind of steer the technical change in a labor-friendly way. How do you look upon that? Is that possible, or if it's possible, should it be done, and how should it be done?
Yeah. So I think the part of the book and the vision of the book, which I totally agree with, is that we shouldn't think of technology as deterministic. Like when we talk about AI, we shouldn't think of it, this gives you one path that we're going to go down and that's it. I think the technology opens up lots of possibilities, and the path that takes depends on how we choose to organize our societies, whether we choose to have it all going to, say, people right at the top, or whether we try and share some of those benefits. And we can steer that technology to some extent. So, for example, with climate change, we're trying to invest in, lots of renewables to steer technology in a particular direction. So it can be done, medicine, for example. So I think in principle, they're right that we want to steer technology in a kind of labor-friendly way. I think it's kind of more challenging. It's not as easy as maybe some of my colleagues think it is, because, how do you exactly do that? What are the policy levers that you can use to steer the technology? In a way, with environmental technology, it's kind of, we have a clearer vision about what we need. We want to shift from coal and oil to renewables. So we want to go to solar and hydrogen and hydro, and not into oil and coal. But with the kind of technologies which are going to augment workers, it's not quite so clear exactly, some cases, yes, it's clear a robot's going to replace a person. Is it clear that, that Chat GPT is going to wipe out all our jobs, or is very bad for what's going to happen to workers, or is it going to augment what we do? So I think I think the challenge of steering is more tricky than it is for some other technologies. So it's definitely possible and desirable. How we do that, I think, is quite challenging. I mean, I do think that the book is could come across to have the view that we shouldn't really worry very much about productivity growth. We should worry about steering the direction of technical change. And I think for many countries, having ways of increasing productivity growth is still a really beneficial thing. So I think in Britain, for example, the problem isn't the falling labour share. The problem is that we've had almost no productivity growth for 15 years. Productivity growth has fallen from like 2.5% a year to 0.5% a year, and wages have hardly increased at all. And that's because productivity growth has not gone up. So I think that it's important to think about. I wouldn't want to lose the importance of the the rate of technical change or the rate of productivity growth, not just the kind of the direction of it. I think, you know, the old-fashioned economist view, if you like, still is important, and we have to really focus on how we could, you know, get back to more sustainable productivity growth.
Yeah. You have a big productivity commission in the UK. And I think one of the topics they discuss is this diffusion aspect, the difference between the big superstar firms and the rest of the firms. So I think that is kind of a important policy discussion, how to connect more firms to the big firms and how to make the small firms more productive in themselves.
Yeah.
So, do you have any ideas or thinking about that?
You're talking about the Productivity Institute that
Yes.
Bart Van Ark runs? Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, this has been something which we've been thinking about for a long time. The UK has relatively low productivity compared to, say, France, Germany, or the US. Amongst some of the big firms as well as less big firms. But yeah, so what are the, I mean, one way to think of this is how to speed up diffusion. So how to speed up the rate in which ideas flow across different firms. And I think there's a number of different ways that you can try to do that. And I think, well, actually, one point I should make is that I think the way that ideas, we shouldn't just think of this as like hard technologies, like using, you know, more AI or more digital technologies. We should also think about this as how you improve your management quality, your management practices. So that's one of the, you know, it's the softer type of technologies which matter as well as hard technologies. But I think for both of these, there's a set of things that we can do. So one of those is through competition, actually. So stronger competition is a great way to spur firms to take up these new technologies, because if they don't, then they're going to go out of business. So having a good competition policy, like I was discussing, is really important and strengthening competition. A second way is through, you know, being open to new ideas coming in from foreign direct investments or from trade or from universities. There's a big role for improving linkages between universities and firms. That happens a lot in the US, actually. Like, think about MIT and Cambridge, or Stanford and Silicon Valley. That happens much less in European firms. So being able to somehow get some of the, you know, ideas going into the ivory tower with local businesses in these clusters or agglomeration is a third super important type of thing. I think there's a really important role for human capital in all of this. And not just the kind of classic thing about sending people to universities, but also about trying to get the kind of skills that we need for the both the future and also to help people retrain and move from one area to the other. And that requires combinations of stakeholders. So it requires local governments working together with trade unions often, or representative labor, as well as with the central government and as well with the university and other providers. So that's that I think human capital education is a huge driver of those as well. So I think those are the four structural factors that I would emphasize.
Well, could you then think about the external effects that you should subsidize kind of support for learning and technical developments in small firms to get them to improve fasten their development?
Yeah, I mean, I mean, there are a lot of programs which try to do so. There's this, you know, there's £1 billion actually, and this Help to Grow program in the UK, which is both on the digital side, but more of the managerial side. And those are very much focused on small and medium-sized enterprises. So I think those can be good initiatives. I think that it's important to have, if you're having those types of policies, to set them up in such a way that you can learn from them, because we don't really know, you know, what the best form of training is or the best form of interventions are. So a really important thing for policymakers is to set up, you know, these as experiments, so that you can learn from some of the mistakes that you make as well as the ones which are successful, and then be able to kind of push them out more. So I think having that role for evaluation and experimentation is really important, and also trying to link that up with a kind of broader industrial policy. So to think about strategically what are the areas of the economy you want to develop, and how that can work together with local ecosystems of firms, training, skills.
We are 4 minutes before they finish up. Are there any questions coming in from the viewers? Then please state them now. But I have two kind of finishing questions for you, John. And my first question is, when you think about the potential problems with the superstar firms, do you think there's a problem more in terms of distributional effects, that the labor is not getting their share, or do you think more of the problem is the efficiency side, the less innovation, they use their market power to reduce economic efficiency? And monopsony is kind of a link between the two, but what do you think? Where are the main problems, potential problems?
Yeah, so I mean, so I think in a way, in terms of trends, the evidence, it's hard to find, in my view. I know Alan Manning may have a different view, but I think there's lots of evidence for monopsony. The monopsony is really important, so I totally agree. But in terms of has monopsony got a lot worse over time, I think that's much less clear. So although these firms are getting big, they're not necessarily very big in their local labor markets. So my general feeling is that the bigger worry is on the product market side, that because these firms have more power over the way the industries are working in pricing and innovation and so on, the markups go up, and this tends to reduce wages and reduce labor shares in aggregate, rather than in a purely monopsonistic way. So I kind of worry more about the product market side. Of course, the product market side has both implications for productivity growth, which we should worry about, and that eventually feeds through to average wages, but also to the share of labor and capital, because it tends to depress the overall share going to workers. So I think my view is that, of course, we should be concerned about all of these things. In terms of the trends, my main worry is on the kind of product market power side, and the implications that has for average real wages because of low productivity growth, and lower labor shares because of the bigger markups these firms have.
Okay. Then I continue with this question. If you think, when you sit down and think about the future research in terms of superstar firms, where do you end up then? Which are the main questions that you address or should address in the future?
Yeah, so I think there's a bunch of things around policy. What's the right policies towards these superstar firms, the labor market, the product market, and intellectual property? Those are sets of, I think, really important issues, and whether we need to make interventions. So, and what types of policies should we do, and what can we learn? So I think there's a whole interesting policy agenda, and looking at the impacts of policies. I still think we need to learn a lot about why they have grown. So I've given you my views, this kind of technological view, but I think there's lots of differences across different industries. And understanding those would help us think about what are the underlying root causes of those changes. And I'd also, I'm quite fascinated in this question about the interaction between the growth of these firms and innovation, both the kind of amount of innovation that they're doing, and also how it changes the direction of innovation. So, like as we were talking about Jerome and Simon's book, I do think the question of, is the ways in which you could change the vision of some of these firms to maybe, they argue this, to focus maybe less on just replicating what people do and more onto augmenting what people do. I think that's a really interesting question. So as I said, I don't know the answer to that, but I'd love to see more research on that.
Sure. But do you think anything about your managerial capital? You do the research on that, and how this relates to the growth of the big firms? Can you see differences in leadership and teamwork and so forth?
Yeah, I mean, the management stuff does suggest that these superstar firms tend to have, relatively good management practices. They as they get larger, perhaps they can devote more resources. And the problem is more on the smaller firms, the medium-sized firms, which tend to have much worse management practices. So I think exactly as you were saying before, the question is, what can you do to help the small and medium-sized enterprise, the non-superstars, catch up and potentially overtake the superstars of the future? So policies towards improving the management quality of those smaller firms is really important. I mean, there is an interesting thing that the superstars have these spillover benefits. So some of the productivity the superstars have benefits the smaller firms because they can emulate the ideas. And one of the mechanisms through which that happens is when there are kind of, if you're in the supply chain. So if you can be in the supply chain supplying some of these superstars, some of the evidence I have, people have said, says that's a really good way of actually learning what they do. And so there's something about developing those networks, improving those supply chains. That's a way of actually improving kind of productivity. So it's like we shouldn't be scared of the superstars because they can actually have these benefits. But what we want to do is to try and make sure some of those benefits are more shared with the rest of our economy.
That's a good finish line, I think. You have to go now for your next meeting.
Yes, sorry about that.
Thank you very much, John Morenon, for your presentation, your discussion. It was very insightful and important for us to listen to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for everybody out there who was listening.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.